You're listening to Procurement 6, the weekly podcast from the team at Art of Procurement that summarizes this week in procurement in just 6 short segments.
Hi there, I'm Kelly Barner, and today is Friday, December 16th, 2022.
6.
This week's Procurement 6 is brought to you by Digital Outcomes, Art of Procurement's first multi-day virtual event of 2023, being held on February 15th and 16th. We'll be taking on topics such as tech investment and innovation, digitally enabled user experience, and cybersecurity. Sign up in advance of the event and you'll have access to all of the sessions on demand as soon as they are complete.
5.
This week's podcast features the team from WNS Denali. Alpar Camber, Julie Brignac, and Chris Ironman joined us for an AOP live session on how to supercharge your digital procurement strategy. One of the most important points, in my opinion, came up early in response to a question Philip Eidson asked Alpar. Let's listen to their exchange and we'll regroup on the other side.
We will be talking throughout the conversation a lot about this idea of a digital ecosystem. And as we do that, I thought it would be valuable to just give some context of what you mean when we do talk about digital ecosystems.
So great question. So let me set the stage, because I think everything we'll talk about from there on is going to point back to the ecosystem. And it's actually the ecosystem without digital, and then the role of digital in enabling the ecosystem and make sure it's functioning in a very healthy way. And, this has been years in the working, right? If you think about procurement, the evolution of procurement, we've always kind of focused on what's important, what's a priority in procurement. At one time it was, getting vendors paid on time. Then it was, resolving payment issues, which then we got to issue the right POs in the right context and, making sure it kind of follows through. Then it became, strategic sourcing is creating really valuable, context within your organization's vision and your organization's and lines of business objectives, and how does strategic procurement and sourcing helps identify the best, suppliers in that, spectrum, and making sure the suppliers are in a position to enable the organization's, corporate mission and, meeting its objectives. So, again, going back, it's always been, one thing at a time. And what we've realized over time is actually, it's not just one thing, it's a system of many, right? When you think about the procurement ecosystem, there are many players. Certainly you have the line of business, which we've heard is the most important thing, which they are there to drive a specific, corporate mission and objective and deliver against that. So it starts with understanding their objectives and what do they want from procurement. How can procurement enable that? But that's only one element, one player of the ecosystem. Then you have the suppliers, equally important, right? They're a key part of the ecosystem in creating value out of procurement. So you got stakeholders, you got suppliers, and you got your finance organization who's looking at from an overall financial, commercial perspective. That you got legal, who's looking at things from a risk and compliance perspective. So there are really various players, and then procurement in its own needs to connect the dots. Of these different players, using data, using digital, using process, using expertise, both internal and external knowledge and expertise in making that happen. So that's why over the last 3-4 years, we started to think about the entire ecosystem and how do they become working well with each other, off of each other, creating value. It's not really one thing at a time, but it's looking at the whole system.
It's like this engine that all these components of the gears within the engine that all connect together. And it's interesting you talk about it being really everyone who interacts with procurement or has a reason to be involved in procurement, not necessarily, as we talk, I think, broader about ecosystems, sometimes there's this thought that ecosystem just means technology, just means this, a collection of different technologies, but it's actually way beyond that in terms, and technology is just one part of that.
2 key points here from my perspective. The first is that you should never assume the definition of any word or phrase. In fact, the more often you hear a buzzworthy word or phrase, the more suspicious you should be about whether everyone actually means the same thing. Digital ecosystems are no exception. The second point is that the ecosystem has to extend beyond the data and transactions processed in your platforms. The experience each stakeholder group has is part of the ecosystem. It may not be digital itself, but it is impacted by technology in a way that can alter procurement's value proposition. If you'd like to hear the whole conversation, you have two choices. You can listen to this week's episode of the Art of Procurement podcast, or you can watch the event on demand on our site. Both are available on our website and in the links in today's episode page.
4.
In this week's episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast, I spoke with Jonathan O'Brien, the CEO of Positive Purchasing, someone who has 30 years' experience in the procurement space. He shared his perspective on the state of sustainable supply chains and responsible procurement. And he started by asking whether procurement has matured enough to move beyond enforcement and governance so that we can turn the pursuit of supply chain sustainability into a more collaborative journey. Jonathan also talked about how to create a feeling of shared, cross-functional ownership for sustainability programs, and whether today's popular ESG trend creates such a large target that specific initiatives like carbon emissions, human rights, or supplier diversity may be at risk of getting lost. To listen to my full conversation with Jonathan, or to check out any of the other 90-plus episodes of the Sourcing Hero podcast, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or click the link in today's show notes.
This is Procurement 6 from Art of Procurement. To get notified every time an episode is published, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. 3.
I don't mean to be gossipy, but some stories are too good to skip. Case in point, the dispute between former Apple VP of Procurement Tony Blevins and the leadership team at Apple. Just to catch you up if this is the first time you are hearing the story. Tony Blevins worked in procurement at Apple for over 20 years. This past summer, he was captured on video getting out of his Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren and making a racy comment based on the 1981 movie Arthur featuring Dudley Moore, as a woman with him laughed in the background. The video went viral, to the advantage of TikToker Daniel Mack and to the absolute horror of Apple. They quickly fired him. Well, now Tony Blevins is speaking out. Over the weekend, the Wall Street Journal released an exclusive interview with Blevins. We learned that the woman in the car with him while the video was captured was his wife. We learned that Apple called him at 1:30 in the morning and ordered him to get the video pulled down. When he was unsuccessful at even reaching the TikToker, he was fired with 0 severance. Somewhat oddly, the company still wanted to host a goodbye party for him, and they invited 100 people. But the party broke up when Blevins broke off communication with Apple. We also learned that he was not replaced with a new VP of procurement. Instead, his former team was distributed through operations, so Apple Procurement has gone through some organizational upheaval of their own. Check out the show notes for the full article and ask yourself about the old adage, there is no such thing as bad publicity.
2.
Friend of the show, Kate Vitasic, recently co-authored a piece in the Harvard Business Review titled 3 Ways to Build Trust with Your Suppliers. I'm sure you'll want to read it, and it is linked in the show notes. But first things first, you can't build what you can't measure, right? So how are we supposed to measure trust? That's what Kate and her co-authors set out to determine. They settled on a list of 5 relational elements: focus, communication, team orientation, innovation, and performance. Yes, all 5 are subjective, But at the same time, I think most procurement professionals with a little experience wouldn't find it all that hard to make a binary assessment of their major supplier relationships along those lines. Trust is either there or it isn't, and it is much harder to get back than it is to lose. If you're interested in learning more, check out Kate's article in the Harvard Business Review.
1.
Before I let you go, I want to tease an exclusive guest post that we will be running on Art of Procurement on December 22nd. I can't tell you who it is by, but I can promise you you won't want to miss it. When it comes to managing large, complex supply chains this time of year, this guy is the ungettable get. My team worked hard all year long to earn this interview, so be on the lookout for a little something special as we end the year. To that point, this is the final Procurement 6 of 2022. So on behalf of the entire Art of Procurement team, I want to thank you for joining us all year long, listening to podcasts, participating in LinkedIn Snap polls, and of course, joining us for our many AOP Live and virtual events. We hope you all have a wonderful, safe, and happy holiday season, and we will see you right back here the first Friday in January.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next Friday at 6 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. If you've enjoyed this pod, help us grow and tell your peers to search for Procurement 6 wherever they get their podcasts.